Good evening, everyone. This is Owieli, otherwise affectionately known by all of you as the Bay Southern Belle, and it's been quite some time since I did my previous video, and I've been planning to do this one for a few weeks now concerning a particular topic that I find to be one of the most integral and significant and crucial discussions that we on the right wing need to have, and that is, of course, pertaining to a very controversial topic, that topic being white nationalism. Now, to begin this conversation, I think it's an important precedent to discuss a recent event that occurred in Stone Mountain, Georgia, which I'm sure the vast majority of you are by now familiar with. The event that I'm referring to, of course, is the rally that was supposed to take place in defense of the Confederate monuments at Stone Mountain, but which was subsequently delayed or rescheduled, I prefer to say. And despite the fact that the event was delayed and rescheduled, Antifa decided to make an appearance to the event anyway. And if any of you actually saw any of the visual footage or the photographs that were taken at that event, you know by now that Antifa was explicitly marching down the streets carrying communist flags, fully loaded rifles, burning the Confederate flag, and explicitly calling for the death and execution of all white Americans. This, in fact, is an act of domestic terrorism. This is, in fact, the very definition of terrorism. But the law enforcement in that area, the local government in that area, decided to not only turn a blind eye to this explicit act of domestic terrorism, they decided to protect it and to defend it. The permit that we requested to obtain in order to go to this event at Stone Mountain and to hold a constitutionally protected rally in order to peaceably assemble and speak our minds concerning the erasure and the destruction of our history, our honor, and our heritage, and all that represents us as white Southerners and white Americans, was denied. And our permit was denied on the basis of what is referred to as the heckler's veto. Now, if any of you are familiar with that term, it is an absolutely tyrannical, unconstitutional piece of legislation that denies an individual their right to their constitutional liberties, including the freedom to assemble and the freedom of speech, on the basis that the exercise of those freedoms might invoke a violent response on behalf of their opponents. To put that in simpler terms, according to the government, as of now, in this day and age, you can have your rights deprived from you unconstitutionally and wrongfully and immorally, have your rights taken from you on the basis of the actions of your enemies. So if those that you face are domestic terrorists, if those that you face attempt to invoke violence and provoke some physical opposition and confrontation at any of these events, it is now considered legally acceptable to have your constitutional rights deprived from you on the basis of intimidation and fear of your opponents. If this is not the very foundation and basis of tyranny and the unconstitutionality that we are being plagued with in this country, I truly don't know what does. But the important thing to discuss here is not necessarily simply this event and the consequences of this event, and the consequences of the actions that occurred in that event, which again include the defense of these domestic terrorists on behalf of law enforcement. The implications of this discussion are much wider than that, and is something that does need to be discussed. Many people are quite intimidated by this conversation. Many people find it to be particularly radical or polarizing or even terrifying in some circumstances. And of course, what I am referring to is the philosophy of white nationalism. Many people have had their heads filled with these radicalized and violent images of individuals claiming to be neo-Nazis marching down the streets with swastikas, and they insist upon the fact that this clearly is such a distraught and fractured ideology. And they ask themselves, is this truly the definition of white nationalism? White nationalism is, simply put, the radicalized idea that whites have rights. If you are of the opinion in this country that white Americans possess rights, we are in agreement on that. And this is an intrinsically controversial, vehemently opposed, and inflammatory discussion to have. Why? Because in this country, in the modern and postmodern society in which we live in such a totalitarian and authoritarian society that is so vehemently controlled and infested and infected with liberal and globalist propaganda that you have been sold a lie that whites do not possess rights, that whites do not have constitutional liberties, that whites do not have the ability to say that I am white and I am proud of the fact that I am white, that I have European history and heritage, and I have honor in that European history and heritage, and I have the right to advocate in the defense of those ethnical interests, and yet that's taken from you because it's now considered white supremacy. It's considered intrinsically offensive to racial minorities. It's demonized, it's vilified, it's considered so utterly immoral and atrocious that even the very civil discussion of it, or mention of it, or allusion to it in any conversation is met with the most vehement disagreement. But the fact of the matter is, whites, the establishers of this country, those who conquered this land that we inhabit, those who established the very notions of constitutionality and liberty that began 3,000 years ago in ancient Western civilizations, whites have rights. Whites have liberties, for they are the very ones that laid the very foundation for constitutional liberties and rights. The notion that whites have rights is only considered radical in the eyes of those who not only seek to subvert that identity, but to place racial prominence, racial power, and racial influence within the hands of minorities. The goal, you see, of egalitarianism is not for equality, nor has it ever been. You've been sold a very deceptive lie that Black Lives Matter, that Antifa, and that all of these other leftist agitators and blatant domestic terrorists have any interest in egalitarianism or equality, because they don't. The intention is never to create equality. The intention is to demand reparations. The intention is to demonize, to vilify white identity, so that they may be granted a position of power and influence and authority over white Americans. Many people don't understand what's wrong with that. Many people don't understand any intrinsic problem with that. And they're rather puzzled by the fact that that could ever be considered controversial. But the very fact of the nature of the United States of America, the very facts that we can go by, that we can discuss in the history and heritage of this country, illustrates the fact that we are, of course, a predominantly white society. And we have a right to remain that way. Why? Because we are the establishers of this society. It was in the minds of Europeans that the notions, that the philosophies, that the mentalities of constitutional liberty and democratic republics, and all of these notions that we possess of our liberties and rights and autonomies and personal responsibilities originated within the minds of Europeans. It is within European philosophy that these ideas originated in the first place, and everyone else that has benefited from it must at some point inevitably admit that fact. But to just illustrate for a moment how the law has been so thoroughly subverted and destroyed in favor of the destruction of white identity, this is Title 18, Part 241 of U.S. law, which was explicitly broken in the Stone Mountain event. To quote the law, it states that if two or more persons conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any person in any state in the free exercise of the enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him by the Constitution or the laws of the United States, or because of his having exercised the same, or if two or more persons go in disguise in the highway or on another's property with the intention to prevent or to hinder his free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege so secured, they shall both be fined under this title or imprisoned up to 10 years, or both. This is U.S. law. According to the U.S. law, according to our constitutionally reinforced rights and liberties that we possess in this country, if you impede upon another individual's right to express their freedom of speech, to express their freedom of assembly, to provoke a physical opposition to them, to enact violence upon them, to shut down their liberties, to remove and deprive of them their God-given rights, you can be fined or imprisoned up to 10 years for that atrocity, for that legal travesty. But this is not what occurred at all, in fact. In fact, this is not only the case with this particular event, but this has been an ongoing trend that we've been seeing since Charlottesville. Every single event that is in any way, shape, or form a pro-white event has been met with the most vehement opposition. Why? Because you're being told that you do not possess the rights to advocate for white interests in this country. And that is a blatant lie. The fact is, whites, not only in the United States, but also in Europe and in Australia and in every other location in which they are a predominant demographic, they're being systematically erased. This is a very politically inconvenient fact to discuss, especially with the left, and they like to pretend that this is not, in fact, a reinforced empirical observation, but it is. The fact is, we are being systematically erased. We are being chemically castrated. We're being politically reformed, as they like to call it, or distorted into leftist thinking takes and robotic automatons with no freedom of thought or liberty or individual consideration or anything else. We're being revised, we're being chemically castrated, sublimated, silenced, and erased. And if you believe that to be a conspiracy theory, or if you believe that to be controversial in the least, I would encourage you to look at the statistics, because 28 of the top 30 countries on the globe with the highest fertility rates are African. In contrast to that, 22 of the 30 lowest countries with the lowest fertility rates are European. All 50 states, all of them, there's not a single exception. Every single state in this country has such an incredibly, abysmally low fertility rate that we don't even make the replacement rate. The white race is effectively dying. We are being erased. And if you believe this to be incidental or coincidental or something that's just occurring spontaneously, I would encourage you to look at the political ideologies that are infesting every aspect of our schools, the entirety of our educational system, the entirety of our entertainment system. You are being fed a lie, and that is that it should be acceptable societally, legally, politically, culturally acceptable to have your heritage and your history and your honor erased before your very eyes, to have every aspect of who you are, not only in terms of the monuments that represent your history, not only in terms of the culture and the art and the philosophy that reflect the magnificence of Western civilization, not only these things, but the very blood that courses through your veins is now considered an intrinsically offensive phenomenon to the left. And this may seem radicalized when put into perspective. And many people, particularly moderates and constitutionalists and civic nationalists, would insist upon saying, no, this isn't a racial issue. But I promise you, whether or not you perceive it to be, to the left it certainly is. And it's not going to stop unless something is done to stop it. We are being told the lie that our existence is offensive, and is so tremendously offensive. It's so tremendously demonized and vilified in the civilizations that we ourselves established, that our own governments are insisting upon, that we need to sit idly by and watch as this gradual transformation occurs, not only in our societies, but in all European societies. Not only in America, but across Europe, and in Australia, and in every other location in which whites are a predominant majority. We're told that this should just be allowed to occur. Why? Because it's in the name of tolerance. It's in the name of diversity. It's in the name of acceptance and egalitarianism and equality. Because this is the lie that you have been sold. This is the lie that has been propagated for decades now. And it's not going to stop, because we are told that our history is inherently racist. We are told that our demographical identities are evil and vile. And it is a lie that you have been sold. Every ounce of this political ideology that is permeating throughout American and European society is a lie from hell. You have been lied to insist that your own identity is an atrocity, is an abomination. We have a right to advocate for our own interests. And we certainly will. But it is not until this is recognized, it is not until we understand exactly what we're facing, and that is, of course, a militarized political endeavor to erase white identity, that anything will ever change. And it is something that is being systematically silenced because we're being censored in a variety of different ways. Anytime anyone ever attempts to have this discussion, to acknowledge these very harsh and controversial truths, it's shut down, it's silenced, it's sublimated, it's censored. Because it's inconvenient. It's not considered politically correct or acceptable, but the fact is, the very nature of our existence is in opposition to the totalitarian nature of political correctness and liberalism and globalism and the authoritarianism that insists that we don't have the right to exist in our own countries that we founded, that we established. We don't have the right to exercise the liberties that originated in our own thoughts, in our own philosophies, in our own cultures. What is truly offensive is the notion that it could ever be considered acceptable in societies that we established to suggest that we do not possess the right to exercise the liberties that we ourselves founded. That is what I find offensive. I find the destruction of our monuments, the erasure of our history, the desecration of our heritage to be offensive. So I will always stand in opposition to the totalitarianism that insists that we don't possess these rights, because we do. These rights are in our blood, in our identity. We will always fight for them, irrespective of whether that fight is simply in terms of these discussions, whether that fight is simply in terms of political ideology and standing in opposition and holding these events and these rallies and organizing and discussing why we have the right to exist, discussing why we have the right, the intrinsic liberty to fight for what is ours. And we will. We will continue to do so, and I will continue to do so until the day that I die. The future of Western civilization, the future of white identity, is entirely contingent upon our work right now and what we're willing to fight for. Because if we are not willing to take up the mantle for white civilization and white identity and stand in opposition to the Marxist, globalist hordes who insist upon erasing that identity, what is it that we will leave our descendants? What kind of society will we leave for our children? There will be nothing left to leave them. So this is a wake-up call for all of you. This is a wake-up call for all Europeans, for you, the Russians, for the Germans, for the French, and the British, and the Poles, and the Romanians, and the Swedes, and the Greeks, and the Czechs. You Americans, you Europe, you have an identity. And you will retain that identity if you possess the capacity to rise up and fight for it. And as for me, this is something that I feel so passionately and ambitiously about. It is something I will fight for until the day I die. And it is something that all of us must be so wholeheartedly committed to. And if we're not, and if we stand by in the complacency of civil discussion and conversation, and we stand by in the convenience and the complacency of being told that we do not possess the right to exist, we will lose it all. So in that sense, yes, I do suppose you could call me a radical, because the very nature of my existence is offensive and radical. So if it requires being labeled and demonized and vilified as a radical to stand up for what I believe in, then by all means, from this day forward and until the day I die, I will gladly embrace the title of a radical.